Good evening and welcome to the urban.co.uk and National Landlord Association webinar on licensing, a topic we get a lot of questions from landlords on. We're very lucky to have Gavin Dick with us today from the National Landlord Association. Gavin, could you tell us a bit about what you do at the association, please?
Hi, I work for obviously the National Landlord Association, and I cover local government and all legislation affecting local government, including licensing.
Fantastic. So, starting with the basics, what is licensing? What different types of licensing is there?
There's three main types of licensing. There's mandatory, where any HMO has to have a license. Additional, when local authorities can apply for a further reaching of HMO licensing, and selective, when everyone within a geographical area has to have a license.
Okay, and so does it only apply to HMOs? Is there any licensing across the UK for residential landlords?
Selective.
Okay.
Selective would apply to any landlord in the area who is got a property to rent out.
Okay, and why was licensing introduced?
Good question. This all dates back to 2004 Housing Act, and in the Act it gave powers for mandatory licensing. A lot of this comes from the studentification of areas, the growth of private rented sector, and the appeal or the willingness or wanting to pretend to do something by politicians. And that created the 2004 Housing Act, which created mandatory licensing, which came into effect 2007-2008, and also had the ability for local authorities to introduce additional and selective licensing.
Okay, and is it working?
This is a bizarre question, because if you ask the local authority, some would say yes, it's working. If you ask the landlord community, they could quite happily say no, it's not. So I think it depends on what you define as what it's working to achieve and what it's working to its goals to be. I would say it's partially working. It's not delivering what it should deliver, and that's down to a number of reasons.
Okay, and so if a landlord needs to get a license, what do they do? How do they know they've got to do it?
They have to, by law, if they're renting out a statutory HMO, have one. If they don't have one, you can get prosecuted. Additional selective, you have to be aware of what's happening in your locality. So you have to know what's going on in your local authority. Simple as that. It's the law in this country is that you should know what the law is, not someone having to explain to you.
And does the National Landlord Association help you with that? Can you phone them up and ask them about your specific area?
Of course, the National Landlord Association. It's fantastic. No, we've got many tools on our website. There's a look-up facility, so you can see if your area is covered by licensing, what the licensing is, and what the likely fees to be. Equally, we also run campaigns on when schemes are being proposed, introduced, and what our view on those schemes will be.
Okay, so how many areas in the UK require additional licensing?
Around about 20. It's increasing. A licence lasts for 5 years.
Okay.
So after 5 years, the council can then reapply to have another licensing. So we're in the third round of mandatory licensing. So the local authority can introduce, was mandated to introduce it. Then 2007, and obviously renewal in 2013, and now we're coming up. So it depends when the council introduced it, but there'll be in the third time a landlord has to apply to get a licence. Additional selective stands as a 5-year scheme. Mm-hmm. At the end of 5 years, that scheme dies and there's no more. And if the council wishes to have another additional selective licensing, they have to then reapply to get a licence. So therefore the council starts a consultation process and has a new standalone licence. So they don't run in perpetuity, they run for 5-year blocks at a time. Mm-hmm. And it's from that councils will get. So how many are there in the UK? They are increasing, but there's around about 20-25.
So you mentioned it's increasing. Are you seeing a trend that more and more councils are wanting to do this?
Yes, and it's for a number of reasons. I suspect A lot of it is virtual signalling by the politicians to give the impression that they're doing something, but without actually having to do anything. Look at us, we're being tough in the private rented sector, please vote for us, but not actually delivering anything in the back end of it. So it is just a signal that they're doing something, as opposed to actually dealing with the actual issues which they say is in the area. A lot of it comes down to community pressure, or the perception that they're doing something in a community. The example is studentification of an area. So if you take an area of where there's a large university conurbation, universities expanded dramatically in the 2000s. So you had sort of more or less doubling from 2000 to 2010. Councils wanted to give the impression that they were doing something, because many of the local people didn't quite like the number of students moving into an area. When the doubling of university students took place, there was no provision made for the students, and the private rented sector sort of stood up and actually delivered housing for those students. And that's changed the whole dynamic of communities. And from that, you've got residents' associations or certain councils saying, oh, we don't like this. And what they're trying to do is hark back to a previous page in time. And therefore they think, oh, well, we'll introduce licensing because it shows to the community we're doing something. But it doesn't tackle the actual issue which the community wanted tackled in the first place, which is the removal of the students. So it's impression given by councils that they're doing something as opposed to actually doing something.
So licensing in the student area would limit the amount of properties that can be let to
No,
students?
not necessarily. It's only when you then introduce an Article 4 direction that you can start limiting stuff. They can in theory, because they don't have to give licenses out, but what it is giving, it's a case of there is nothing a council can do to stop people living in a house, really, or yes, there are things, but overall, if the students have arrived and what the councils are trying to do is put retrospective legislation in place, which doesn't work because the properties have converted to student properties, and the councils are trying to say, well, we want to stop that because they're trying to gather votes from the local residents. So they're giving the impression they want to do something, but they're not actually doing anything. So they effectively managed to alienate both groups at the same time, which isn't the cleverest, but it's local authorities. So you've got this situation where they want to pretend to do something. They've introduced additional licensing so they can limit them, or they can pretend they're doing something. They introduce an Article 4, which is a planning policy, which means you then have to apply to the council for planning permission. But actually, what it creates is a crystallisation of the properties in that area on that specific day, say it was 2011. So if there was in an area of 5,000 properties and 1,000 were HMOs, once they introduce additional in Article 4, what you end up with is that 1,000 properties staying how they are forever.
Sure. Because
they then gather extra value because they are shared as usage. No new shared usage can come in. So what the councils do is close the market.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting analogy. I mean, one of the things we saw in Bath was the properties that had shared usage status gathered more value when they were sold than those that didn't. There was a property sold for 290,000 that had shared usage. One that didn't have shared usage sold for 250, and they were literally 3 doors apart on the same street, sold within a month. So, and there was nothing significantly different between the properties.
Yeah. Okay, and does it differ across Wales and Scotland, or is it?
Yes, Wales has got licensing. Scotland doesn't. This whole Scottish system is different, and obviously will be even more different come December. But several Welsh councils have got additional and selective licensing schemes in place as well as Rent Smart Wales.
Sure. So it doesn't. The rules are the same. It's just.
They are similar, the rules, but again, it's councils giving the impression they're doing something when really don't.
Okay. So If I need a license in a specific area and I don't get one, what are the penalties for not adhering to that?
It's straightforward. It's a strict liability offence. You either have a licence or you don't. If you don't have a licence, you'll be prosecuted in a court of law for not adhering to the law.
Is there standard penalties, or is it imprisonable? Or
I would imagine if there was a significant problem because of it, you could be imprisoned, but that'd be for separate things. But there is a fine up to £30,000 per licence you don't have.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have 10 properties, you could be facing a £300,000 fine.
Wow! And there's cases of landlords.
Regularly.
Yeah. Okay. Define HMO and the various licensing terms, please.
Sure. I mean, an HMO is a property that's rented out by at least 3 people who are not from one household but have shared facilities.
Okay.
Then you have what's known as what comes under the mandatory HMO, which is when it's rented by 5 or more people not forming a household, and is at least 3 stories in height, and tenants share toilet, bathroom, kitchen facilities. Now the issue, as I said about Hackney, is for the additional licenses, is they want to remove the 3 people, and remove that down to 2 people. So you and your husband, you and your wife,
sure,
would then be caught. In theory, in a 1-bedroom flat, which is kind of bizarre, but there we go. And selective licensing is anyone within a geographical location. So if they say everyone within a postcode of SO, whatever, say SO 21, would have to have a license within
and that's not HMOs. That's anyone who wants
anyone
to rent a property.
Anyone who's renting a property out within that geographical location would have to have a license. There are a couple of exemptions, but really it's everyone who has to have a license, and they have to apply to the local authority and pay a fee for it.
Sure. And what is that fee generally?
It varies. Selective licensing is somewhere between roughly £350 to about £600, £700.
Okay.
Depends on the local authority.
Per year or 5
well,
years?
This depends on the local authority again, but normally it's for 5 years.
Sure. Okay.
The exemption is Oxford. Oxford have got the weird calculator, which means that you have to apply in some cases every year or every 2 years for a licence,
Sure.
and their licence is over £1,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
So when you say apply every year, does that mean you could get it 1 year and not the following?
In theory, yes.
Wow. So that could land you in hot water if you've got tenants.
Yeah, and effectively you then have to serve notice to some of your tenants, and then rent to a family.
Sure.
And whatever family is an interesting idea. I mean, lots of councils talk about this family housing they have, this idea of what a family house is. Whereas when you go and speak to the planning department, a family house is also a 2-bedroom flat.
Yeah, yeah.
So this idea is what a child draws of the house with the windows at the front and the front door and the chimney, and it's like a 4-bedroom detached house. Sure. That's when you start talking, that's what politicians are talking about. Whereas when you get to the planning department, it's a 2-bed flat. Yeah. And there's a sort of distance between the two. And that's when they start coming into, oh, well, we want to have family housing in this area, and therefore we're going to have to introduce licensing to get control or whatever. And it's all just an excuse for them to introduce it.
So in Scotland, every landlord has to be registered, and there's some new changes coming in. Could you tell us a bit about that, please?
Yeah, the Scottish law has always been different from England, and the changes they're bringing in are around how tenancies work and what the changes can actually mean. So the first thing they're going to have is the changing of the presumption, so from where currently the landlord ends tenancy to the tenant ending tenancy. Mm-hmm. So the tenant would serve notice on the landlord that tenancy then ends. We reckon there's going to be some challenges around this, especially around student areas, because students predominantly rent property or look to have a property in the January of a year for when they're moving in the September or the summer. Where this then changes is the landlord can't guarantee that property will be vacant in the summer, because the tenant has to give notice. So there's challenges around that. This all starts on the 1st of December. You've also got tenant rent pressure zones, where a local authority can apply to the Holyrood and ask for permission to introduce a rent pressure zone. I suspect that they will all be becoming rent pressure zones very quickly. This is very prescriptive on what rents can be charged and what they can increase. Equally with the tenancy, there will be a prescription of rents can only increase annually. There could be a challenge around this because whereas a lot of landlords today don't charge or don't increase the rent during the tenancy, they wait to a new tenancy. Because it's now prescriptive within the tenancy that your rent will go up annually, landlords will look to maximise, because they don't know when it'll be.
Sure.
That means that rent will go up year on year. So I don't think this will necessarily be beneficial to tenants in many ways either, because they will now face an annual guaranteed rent increase, whereas previously they didn't. So there's lots of changes happening in Scotland. We're doing quite a lot of work on that at the NLA. On our website there's quite a lot of information, and obviously with the new tenancies we'll have those in place as well, and the grounds that a landlord can bring to end a tenancy. There are certain prescriptive rules.
Do you think these changes will then come over to England?
Possibly. We've already heard Jeremy Corbyn and Labour talking about rent control, and how they think this is the great winner, whereas in reality it's been proven globally not to work. But the idea of somehow promising everything today to people is very popular amongst politicians. So some of it will. The letting agent fee ban that came from Scotland, that was introduced in Scotland, that saw rents increase. But then they deny that happened. But the evidence was quite clear.
Sure. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit more about HMOs in details. When do I have to get a licence for an HMO? When do I cross that boundary into HMO territory? What's defined as an HMO?
The government's got a statutory definition. The problem with HMOs is there's 3 different definitions.
Okay.
And this is where problems start developing. There's a statutory definition of what an HMO is, and that is under the 2004 Act, which case you have to have a licence before you can actually rent the property out.
Sure.
Then you've got the non-statutory HMOs. They could be picked up under additional licensing, in which case you then need to have an additional licence. Failure to have a licence when you've rented the property out puts you in breach, which means that you can be prosecuted. Equally, the tenants could then apply for a rent repayment order, and you'd have to pay back the rent to the tenants as well.
Sure. So mandatory licensing covers the standard definition of HMO if you fall within that.
Yeah.
And additional licensing if there's any specific criteria within the area which the local council would essentially decide themselves. So it could vary council to council.
It does vary from council to council. We're currently Hackney is currently consulting on additional licensing, and their definition is just madness. It's 2 people forming a family, 2 people unrelated living in a block could be constituted as an HMO.
So 2 professional sharers?
2 professional sharers, or
so half of London.
Yeah, it's 2 unrelated people. So if you've moved in with your boyfriend, girlfriend,
oh, right, okay,
or you rented a property and your boyfriend and girlfriend have moved in, because you're unrelated and the only definition they accept as related is married, that is where the problems start coming from. So it's the definitions.
And is that in Hackney?
No,
or
they're consulting it at the moment. And this is where the problems start coming from. So whereas you've got your statutory definition, which is it's got to be 3 stories. So it's very clear what it is, even though some councils still haven't registered all the properties and they've been in place for 10 years.
Case in Hackney, so 3 stories.
No, this is additional licensing.
Oh, okay.
So mandatory licence has been in place 10 years.
Sure.
Everyone should have a licence.
Yeah.
The problem with all licensing is it comes from, this is where the law is, and this is where councils have got to in the enforcement side. So when you hear of places, people getting prosecuted still for having mandatory HMOs not having a licence, you do have to question, what's the council been doing for the last 10 years? Because the law's been in place for 10 years, and it's quite easy to spot a 3-storey building.
Yeah, sure.
So therefore there is a question around this. What the problem developing is with councils bringing in additional licensing is that, again, they're doing it to try and just say they're doing something.
Yeah.
They normally come in with the rationale of, oh, it's to do with property standards or whatever, and then you start saying, well, how many inspections have you done? What have you done to solve the problem? And then they come back with these bizarre answers. Oxford, when they went to renew it, they came out with, well, we haven't inspected all the properties yet. But actually, the landlords have paid for that,
Sure.
and the council failed to do its job. So therefore, why should those landlords have to pay again for the council's failing to do its job?
Sure.
So they agreed a fee. They said this is what it would be to do the work, but they never did it. So is the council then in breach of contract with the landlords for not doing the work?
Sure.
And that's an interesting question, but not today. So there's lots around this in that your bog standard statutory HMO should be licensed, should be in place, and if you don't have one, the council can prosecute you. Additional licensing, if it's been brought in, each council's slightly different and they put slightly different conditions onto it. Again, you as a landlord need to know what's happening in the area and have applied for a licence.
Sure. And I think we get loads of questions with people ringing up saying, I've got these tenants, do I need a licence? And I think the best way is just to ring your council and ask them.
Yeah.
They're going to have the information and be able to tell you that.
I mean, all council websites does actually have the information,
Sure.
what is. And where the interesting bit comes from is understanding the relationship between an Article 4 direction and additional licensing or mandatory licensing. Because it sits separately, and councils love to tell you they're separate things. An Article 4 is a planning document, which sits in the planning department, and licensing sits within the environmental health department.
Sure.
And the two departments don't normally speak that much together, so they don't actually have joined up policies. Not only that, planning is a different definition of an HMO to the environmental health department, so you can see where the problems are starting
Sure.
from.
Yeah.
Then an Article 4 in certain areas will say no more shared housing, and for you to then get a shared house you would have to apply for planning permission, at which point the councils would then object. In theory, you then have the ability to appeal. But for permission now, if you're looking to buy a property to rent out as an HMO, you're not going to do that, because why would you go through that entire process, which could take up to a year,
Yeah.
to buy a property, whereas the sellers think, well, this guy's a joke. He's just delaying it.
Yeah, sure.
So therefore it's not thought through in those terms. So therefore the Article 4 stops you getting a licence, because you would never be granted shared usage. So therefore you can't apply for a licence for shared usage. And that is the problem with it.
Okay. Is there any changes coming in?
Well, the government review on extending mandatory licensing is due out next year. We're expecting that probably in April of next year, and that's where they're probably going to remove the height element. So whereas it's 5 people forming 2 families of unrelated people, that's going to be reduced down to 1 story.
Sure.
So there's going to be a lot more people brought into.
That's going to widen the scope.
It's going to widen the
massively.
scope massively and bring a huge amount more into it. Where this is going to have a massive impact is probably in more rural parts of this country, whereas the majority of HMOs are in specific areas and built up cities or in university towns. Where there's been a historical or seaside towns is another area. Where this will expand it into is areas which don't normally have HMOs. So the smaller borough councils around the country which don't have this geared up for.
So, moving on to getting your licence, what do you have to do to apply for a licence?
Effectively, fill out a form for the local authority, pass a fit and proper person check, and obviously the big thing is pay the council some money. And that's really, then the council will issue you with a licence. The issue most landlords have is the length of time it takes for the council to issue a licence. We've had landlords in Liverpool waiting over 2 years to get a licence issued, which actually creates quite a few little problems. For example, they're meant to have a licence. So if a tenant says, show me your licence, the landlord wouldn't actually have a licence at that point because the council hasn't issued them.
Sure.
But in an ideal world, the council would issue the licence more or less straight away, and the landlord would then be licensed for the 5-year period.
So if you've got tenants and you've got an application outstanding, you're still liable for potential...
You are effectively licensed because you've submitted the application. Okay. This is when it gets into this area of, as long as you've submitted a licence application, you are deemed to have a licence.
Okay.
So this is why they have what's known as an early bird discount in some cases, or you can apply before the licence comes into play. So if the licence was to come into play on 1st of November or whenever, you would normally have a few months beforehand to pay.
Yeah.
Now, what councils haven't ever worked out is landlords aren't going to pay money to a council several months before it's due. So they will pay near to the end date as possible.
Yeah.
So they will probably pay the last week of October, if the last date is 1st of November, or as late as they can. Then the council then has a difficulty processing all the applications because it's right at the last minute. So there needs to be some more work done, I think, by some local authorities on how do we get this in, or whether they actually space it out. Otherwise, you just get a glut at the last minute, because why would a landlord give local authority £500 per property for several months when it's better in their bank account, getting very negligible interest, but still better than their account, than a local authority gaining the interest?
But I suppose if it's additional licensing, then you might not get the license just because you've applied.
Similar with selective licensing, but you would. I mean, the vast majority would get a license.
Nice.
As long as you pass the fit and proper person check and you fill in all the paperwork correctly, you would get a license.
And what is this fit and proper person test? Is there anything that would exclude you from that?
Oh, it's if you've committed crimes, particularly around the housing or individual take. No, there's a whole lot of areas around it which you can't have a criminal record in certain areas. So if you've got a criminal record for aggressive behaviour against people, ABH, you're out of prison, those sorts of crimes, or you've committed fraud, or you've been prosecuted for not having your house up to standard before. So the vast majority of landlords would pass.
Yeah. Another thing to ask your council, perhaps, before you apply for the licence.
Well, yes. I mean, you would know as an individual if you would pass a fit and proper person check. I think most people know if they've got a criminal record or not.
Okay, so we've got a few questions coming in from landlords, which we'll go through before we wrap up today. First one: what are councils actually aiming to achieve by introducing selective licensing?
They normally claim it's to resolve specific issues. A lot of them use the sort of standard ones of antisocial behaviour, which effectively just means the landlord moves a tenant to another property, or not necessarily their property, but to end tenancy if the tenant's committing antisocial behaviour. Waste is always a big one for local authorities. They love to say landlords are responsible for the tenant's waste. In many cases, it's the tenant. Fly tipping, again, they like to blame landlords for fly tipping when really it's the tenants. A lot of this can be resolved if the council actually applies reasonable policies, in that a good one would be allowing landlords to use the local waste facility, but they don't. So landlords can't even dispose of the waste, or they come and collect the waste from the tenant. Councils don't, they want to charge
So councils can actually make landlords responsible for that?
No, but they like to.
They like to, okay.
So it's one of these weird situations. So if a tenant ends a tenancy, Landlord is sitting there saying, right, regain the property. They look at it, there's lots of waste. Technically, it's not their waste, it's the tenant's waste. So the landlord would then try and take it to the local tip. But under strict law, they need a waste transfer licence because they're not a waste carrier.
Sure.
Then when they turn up to the tip, the council will say, is this your waste? The landlord will go, no. And they say, well, it's a commercial tip, we're going to charge you for that.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden the landlord's going, well, hang on, this is not even my waste.
Mm.
So there's lots of issues that local authorities can work through that. And a simple thing would be to allow landlords who are registered with organisations like the NLA to have free access to the waste facility. Some councils do that. And it does make a huge difference. It tackles the issue. Instead, what they're doing is they're trying to create problems when actually solutions are what they should be looking for.
Another one we've got, if I don't have a licence, could it impact on my ability to serve a Section 21?
Yes.
Yeah.
You won't be able to serve one.
And you could be fined by a council.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And the tenant can then claim all the rent back. Little things.
Get a licence, I suppose. Can local licensing requirements override legislation?
They take... I'll answer slightly different. They don't override legislation, they add to legislation. So what they'll do is put additional conditions on. Mm-hmm. So it's not a case of... They can't ask you to do something that is illegal. They can't ask you to break a law. So what they'll do is put additional conditions on. For example, part of the conditions they all have is you have to get a reference. Mm-hmm. It doesn't say you have to get a good reference, it just says you have to get a reference.
Sure.
So you have to get a reference. Or they'll say, a couple of situations we've had where councils have said, if you get antisocial behaviour, you have to tackle it and deal with it. Well, actually all that means is you'll enter tenancy. That is you discharging your duty properly, but all it means is that tenant that's causing the problem is moved around and starts problems elsewhere. So they don't think through what the solution is. They have their idea what their ideal solution would be, which is huge intervention, but that's not the way that the private rental sector works or is geared up to deal with, because the overwhelming majority of landlords aren't geared up to deal with people with mental health issues, drug addiction, alcohol addiction. They're not social workers, they're landlords.
Yeah. Any benefits that you can think of to landlords? Have you seen anywhere where it works and it's benefited the landlord?
It can benefit landlords if it's implemented in the correct way.
Mm.
Now, the idea of selective licensing, and this is specific to selective licensing, is to tackle specific problems. So if there was a street where there was a huge amount of drugs or alcohol or prostitution, absolutely, to identify who owns the properties to rectify those situations. Where it comes to these blanket approaches just across whole areas where councils are hoping it's going to solve a specific issue, it's never going to solve those issues. Most of the issues that councils are trying to solve have got very little or nothing to do with the private rented sector. It's to deal with the tenants within the private rented sector who have been expelled from social housing, who have got issues that need to be resolved. And actually what it requires is partnership working with landlords and other agents to solve the specific issues.
And do you see it working in many areas?
It's worked in little areas. It's always difficult because you always see as someone, yes, it's worked in this specific situation, sure, but overwhelmingly it doesn't really work. Okay. It has got problems. What we like to see is councils actually resolving the issues, and that is a case of what is the problem they're trying to rectify. Instead of just throwing as many issues as they can to say, well, we're going to solve all these issues. It's not. What is the actual underlying issue they want to get? We've had the extremes of saying it's going to increase house prices. How the stigmatisation of an area is going to increase house prices shows how little they understand the housing market at all. Antisocial behaviour. Well, antisocial behaviour is not the cause of a landlord. Mm. If the landlord's causing antisocial behaviour, yes, that could be a problem. But if it's a tenant, how is the landlord going to manage that tenancy? Well, actually, a landlord's powers are very limited.
Sure. And what does what's the NLA doing? Do they Do councils consult you? And
Yeah, councils have got a statutory duty to consult with everyone. They have a statutory duty to consult for a minimum of 10 weeks, probably more. And and obviously we respond. All our consultations are on our website. We do respond. As I say, Hackney at the moment is consulting with some very interesting definitions. And we will respond. Those are on the website. You're more than welcome to email us at policy@landlords.org.uk and we can let you know. But on the website there is details of licensing schemes around the country.
Well, fantastic. Well, Gavin, thank you very much for being with us today. We've really enjoyed the chat, and I'm sure everyone listening would have as well. So thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you.
As usual, if you have any questions, please email info@urban.co.uk and we'll get them answered on the Landlord University as soon as possible. The next webinar is on abandonment. How do you deal with a seemingly empty property? That's on the 12th of December at 7 p.m. and promises to be an interesting one. Tonight's webinar will be downloadable on the Landlord University and on the NLA's YouTube channel, and we'll send a follow-up in the next couple of days. As always, any feedback, good or bad, or suggestions for future webinars, please email Polly or I on info@urban.co.uk. Thanks again for joining us, and see you next time.